The Sega Dreamcast is fondly remembered for both the fun and quality it brought to the table. The once world's most powerful game console delivered to us unforgettable experiences, such as Soul Calibur and Shenmue. But did you know that this exact same console generation, Sega also had another platform up their sleeve? Today we will visit this story and explore the murky past surrounding a lost piece of hardware, which many will not be aware was even a thing. So sit back and relax and join me as we take a nostalgic trip through history to look back at one of Sega's most mysterious unreleased systems. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the intriguing story of the Sega Black Belt. Yeah. The late 90s was a turbulent time to be a Sega fan, as although the Sega Saturn existed, offering up great games like Nights into Dreams and Guardian Heroes, the system's future was looking forever more uncertain. The Saturn was a fun device with a unique library of games, however as intriguing a selection of titles that the system had, there was no denying that sales-wise the platform far from lived up to the company's high expectations. Completely eclipsed in relevance by the Sony PlayStation, the PlayStation's perfect product positioning paired with Sega's own business blunders had pretty much sealed Saturn's fate as a runner-up console. Of course, this simply was not good enough, particularly when we consider that just one generation prior, the Genesis had a strong presence in the living room. Moving past the 16-bit era and deep into the next console war, it wasn't long until Sega fell into third place, with the Saturn lagging behind both the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Even in Japan, a region where the Saturn had sold comparatively well to elsewhere, the Nintendo 64 was beginning to eat further into Sega's market share. So something drastic would need to be done for Sega to stand any chance of reversing their fate in the hardware market. In this fight for market survival, it would only be a matter of time before both Sega of Japan and Sega America would be scrambling around in hot pursuit for a solution to this problem. A solution which would ultimately result in the release of a Sega Dreamcast. But on the journey to this happening, a completely different Sega console would be conceived to be the Sega Saturn follow-up. But what was this lost next generation hardware all about? And why was it created in tandem to the Dreamcast? Well, in order to understand the second part of this question, we first have to understand what sort of company Sega was at the time. A well-documented part of history that ties up nicely to this story relates to the botched launch of the Sega Saturn. It is said that in the lead up to the monumental mistakes that were made with this process, the rocky relationship between Sega America and Sega of Japan contributed to sealing the Saturn's doom. During this time frame, Sega America would be tasked with extending the life of the Genesis, a goal which would include them developing and releasing the poorly received Genesis 32X add-on. To compound problems, Sega of Japan would develop and announce the launch of the Sega Saturn, Sega's true next-generation system that Sega America had not even been made aware of up until this point. This meant that Sega of Japan and America would end up messily competing with themselves, with two bits of new hardware both being scheduled for similar launch windows. As for this well-documented tale's relevance to today's story, it is worth bringing up as we are covering yet another example of Sega of Japan and America competing with each other, leading to detrimental results. As for these two entities, who were known for working independently from one another, both would begin to develop their own sequel to the Sega Saturn. That's right, their own sequel. In this silly process of one-upmanship, one thing was very clear. If Sega were to beat the PlayStation, they were going to need to come up with something much more powerful than what they already had at their disposal. This was a necessity, as the Nintendo 64 was being marketed as the world's most powerful game console, the PC market was evolving, and I guess even they must have known it was only a matter of time before a PlayStation 2 would be coming along as well. Sega was going to need to pull off something spectacular if they wanted to survive in this cutthroat hardware industry. So both divisions of Sega would begin scouring the globe looking for inspiration. As mentioned earlier, during this time, home PCs were beginning to become more and more powerful, so Sega would look to the personal computer market for power. Sega's eyes would quickly be caught by two graphical standards that were dominating the industry: the Power VR series by Videologic and the Voodoo cards by 3DFX. Sega of Japan would end up further investing in the Power VR series, with Sega of America choosing to conduct research around the Voodoo cards by 3DFX. Eventually, each division would begin developing a game console based around each respective standard. In Japan, a project codenamed Dural would take place, involving development around the video logic side of things, with the codename Dural being taken from the Virtua Fighter character of the same name. As for Sega, in the United States, they would begin laying down the foundations to produce a 3DFX based console, which would be codenamed Black Belt, the very core subject of this video. In 1996, a gentleman named Shoichiro Irimajiri would become the new chairman and CEO of Sega America, a personal friend of Sega president Hayao Nakayama. Assessing the Black Belt's progress, he would opt to hire Tatsuo Yamamoto, a former IBM engineer, to work on the project to provide as strong a team as possible. However, as is often the case in these Sega America versus Sega Japan stories, the usual competition and friction between the two divisions would lead to shenanigans. The man in charge of Project Dural, back in Japan, known as Hideki Sato, would end up stealing Yamamoto, recruiting him to work on Project Dural instead. But let's be fair, would this really be a Sega history video if there weren't layers of drama involved? With two completely different next generation Sega consoles both being in development simultaneously, as one can imagine, this would lead to mass confusion in the gaming press at the time, with all sorts of rumours and misinformation being present. Further to this, since the Black Belt was the system that was being developed in the West, if Western journalists covered the next generation Sega console in the news and in our magazines, more news would often break on the Black Belt rather than anything else. As for this mysterious machine, it was certainly an intriguing bit of kit, as 3DFX were the leaders in the PC video game market at the time. With Project Blackbelt, Sega America opted to use the 3DFX's Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee graphics technology, and after initially trying RISC processors from IBM and Motorola, settled on the SH4 as the CPU of choice as well. What's even more interesting though is that Sega America weren't just intending to use graphics technology from 3DFX within their hardware, as they would opt to go one step further and astonishingly buy a 16% stake in 3DFX by the summer of 1997. If that's not commitment that Sega was serious about the Black Belt, then I don't know what is. Journalists would report that this new console would have a CD-ROM drive featuring a 6 or 8 speed, with the device also including a built-in modem, much like the unreleased Sega Pluto, the mysterious unreleased Sega Saturn variant that never saw a retail release. Building on Project Blackbelt's legacy, the Black Belt would be shown off to developers, with the system being well received by them. The Western developed 64-bit system stood out due to featuring an interface designed specifically to make the machine easy to develop for, an asset that Project Dural was yet to offer. The operating system was created in a way to make it as easy as possible to port PC games straight over to this unreleased Sega system. So what went wrong that would lead to the Black Belt's demise? In March of 1997, Bernie Stolar would become the new CEO of Sega America, becoming the division's president by 1998. This was because Irimajiri had once again been promoted, this time becoming the president of the entirety of Sega. Stolar in 1997 was a strong supporter of Project Blackbelt, viewing it as a worthy successor to the Saturn, the very console he infamously labelled as not our future at E3 of 1997. Obviously, by this point he had already begun to discontinue the struggling Sega Saturn in his region, so it was full steam ahead in the quest to create a successor. Moving on to the dawn of 1998, Japan's Project Dural would become public knowledge, being rechristened Katana. By now, the Saturn seemed to be on its deathbed, with the likes of X-Men vs Street Fighter having its release in the West cancelled. But what on earth happened to Project Blackbelt? Well, history shows us that Sega opted to use the Dural/Katana, which we now know as the Sega Dreamcast. But as we know, Black Belts did not go down without a fight. Tatsuo Yamamoto, who we mentioned getting pinched by Sega of Japan earlier, has stated in the past that the 3D FX based Black Belt was really close to becoming Sega's console. However, Sega would have a change of heart late into its development, opting for his Power VR based console instead. Reports are conflicting and hazy as to whether the Dreamcast or Black Belt would have been the more powerful of the two, but we can look back at early indications of when it was suggested that the Black Belt was being dropped. Serial drama llama of Sonic the Hedgehog fame, Yuji Naka, would be the first person to suggest to the press that the Black Belt project was dead. This was discovered when he stated that his upcoming Sonic Adventure game was impossible to run on a PC due to 3DFX Voodoo cards being too weak to run his game. As with anything relating to the infighting between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, the Black Belt being cut would cause a fair share of resentment between Sega's divisions. This is not surprising considering the end of Project Blackbelt would spell the end for a huge number of Sega of America's staff's runs with the company, including staff layoffs. In fact, it wasn't just a case of staff being let go, but many would also walk out in protest over the decision to drop the Black Belt. American Sega staff were not the only ones who were extremely perturbed by this situation, as it is reported that Electronic Arts were also displeased with the 3DFX Sega technology being kicked to the curb. You see, EA had followed suit and invested in 3DFX, following Sega's lead. It is speculated that the dropping of 3DFX paired with the Saturn's demise in the West all contributed to EA opting to not support the Sega Dreamcast in any capacity. Obviously, those who were most annoyed from all of this was of course 3DFX themselves. After all, they had placed great stock in the process of producing a chip suitable for matching Sega's expectations, only to have that hard work thrown in their face. The bad blood caused by this is believed to be a core reason in the leaking of details and technical specifications of the then secret Black Belt project. To make things worse for 3DFX, Sega's financial investment in their future allowed them to lay claim to the technology behind the project, despite having no intentions to take advantage of it, purely to keep it out of competitors' hands. 3DFX coming out almost empty-handed in all of this meant that in retaliation they would file a $155 million lawsuit against Sega, putting forward that Sega intentionally misled them into believing that their technology would be used when in fact a backroom deal had been done between Sega and the people in charge of Power VR. The lawsuit would be settled in mid-1998 with Sega paying 3DFX over $10 million in damages. Despite the fall of the Black Belt, Sega America would need to run with a Dreamcast. Bernie Stolar had huge ambitions for the next generation Sega machine, even if it was not America's own Black Belt. Sega America would launch a $100 million marketing campaign to promote the Dreamcast, and the rest is now history. While many of us love the Dreamcast today, it is interesting to imagine a different timeline for a completely different Sega console being marketed throughout this iconic timeframe. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, you might enjoy my previous upload on the Sega Saturn 64X add-on. Yeah, cheerio.